So to set the stage, I thought I would just lay out some of the facts about what people have been saying about the likelihood that the United States will continue to be able to dominate in the life sciences, and has been mentioned several times today, what China's likely role in the life sciences may be going forward. So again, to set the stage, here's a quick overview of what people are saying. So for example, a recent Deloitte report based on a survey of biopharmaceutical executives found that a lot of them have concerns about the ongoing strength of the global economy, but more interestingly found that biopharmaceutical executives in Europe and Asia generally are more positive and more optimistic about their industry's growth and performance than were their U.S. counterparts. And so my fellow panelists will elaborate on a number of the factors that may be influencing the biopharmaceutical executives here in the United States and their outlooks on their industries generally. But I'll just reiterate some of the factors that were already mentioned this morning, as well as some specifics. So for one thing, the first panel discussed the substantial cuts to NIH and NSF research funding, which of course lays the foundation for the creation and development of new biopharmaceuticals. Research and development in life sciences is already inherently difficult and risky, but has seen further obstacles arising from current market forces. So according to Crunchbase in 2025, the share of U.S. startup investments going into biotech companies hit the lowest level that it's been in 20 years, as a growing proportion of that startup funding has gone into AI rather than into the life sciences. And of course, the life sciences industries face perhaps even greater obstacles created by the current administration than the previous administration. So for example, I don't think it needs to be said that the current Secretary of Health and Human Services has made clear his distrust not only of vaccines, but also of more traditional pharmaceuticals and medicine more generally, and that has had a negative effect. In addition, because of the recent but significant and substantial cuts to the FDA's funding and programs, we're now seeing a backlog in their drug approvals, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, but also an erosion of public trust in the FDA, a recent loss of the FDA's and other agencies' discretion in interpreting the relevant statutes, and of course, a number of other factors affecting the FDA's approval to continue to approve and introduce new drugs. Turning to China, on the other hand, China is now gaining steam and looms as a force that may soon dominate the world in innovation, including in the life sciences. So for one thing, China has made concentrated efforts to control the pharmaceutical supply chains and to achieve dominion over pharmaceutical manufacturing. But for another thing, China in recent decades has invested heavily in its universities with a recent turn toward the life sciences in the last few years, as reflected in its 14th five-year plan issued in 2021. This turn includes a focus not only on the life sciences research areas, but also on educating a workforce with expertise in the life sciences. And as Mark Cohen noted in the first panel this morning, we're also seeing something of an exodus of talent from the United States back to China. As Mark also noted, China has been much more supportive in the long-term development cycles necessary in the biopharmaceutical industries than market forces in the West have been. And indeed, we see pharmaceutical companies increasing the number of new drugs that they're licensing from China for development in the United States and elsewhere. So in 2024, 24%, almost a quarter of all the global biopharma innovation pipeline came from Chinese companies. China is also now the world leader in genome sequencing. Chinese CROs have also grown both in number and expertise, and thanks to a larger population in China, as well as the significantly lower costs Clinical trials costs are 30% cheaper in China than in the United States, and on average are about 20 to 40% shorter in duration. Thanks to both of those factors, an estimated third of all clinical trials in 2024 were conducted in China. And as of that year, as of 2024, China now conducts more clinical trials in China than we do in the United States. Now, we've seen some pushback on this, of course. One example is the Biosecure Act, which had been proposed to try to prevent certain Chinese biotech companies from contracting in any way with the U.S. government. But as much legislation has been doing lately, we saw this particular bill apparently die on the vine. But with regard to new drugs, China has also made a concerted effort to accelerate not only the invention and development of new drugs, but also the approval of new drugs. So the National Medical Products Administration, which is their analog of our FDA, has multiplied itself in size in order to clear a reported backlog of some 20,000 new drug approval applications in just 2 years. The NMPA also has loosened its restrictions on the use of foreign clinical trials data and made efforts to reduce compliance costs, making regulatory approval yet further streamlined and more attractive there. And in fact, in 2024 alone, the NMPA approved approximately 4 times as many small molecule drugs and biologics as our FDA did here in the United States in the same time period. So there's a lot of reason to be concerned about China overtaking the United States when it comes to life sciences innovation. And so with that, I want to hand it off to our panelists. I think we're going to start with with Tonya here. So Tonya Combs will start us off in talking about some of the background behind these developments and what she thinks may be driving these developments.
Should be really easy. These are small problems, right? Thank you all for taking the time to attend today, and to IPPI and the organizers for bringing us together. As IP scholars and thought leaders, you understand something that some policymakers may miss. Intellectual property is the engine that drives innovation. We're here to discuss the future of American life sciences leadership. And from my perspective, and I'm speaking today from my perspective, it fundamentally depends on preserving and strengthening IP protections. The experts in this room have a key role to play in defending the legal infrastructure that has made us the leader that we are today and the leader that we still want to be tomorrow. As you guys know well, the patent system represents a fundamental bargain. Inventors get essentially limited market exclusivity in exchange for disclosure. This gives others the ability to improve upon that innovation faster. And for biopharmaceuticals, we are uniquely dependent upon this framework. If I take a step back, to have a sustainable biopharmaceutical ecosystem, you essentially need 2 elements working together. First, you need those reliable, robust incentives for innovation, given the extraordinary development costs, the long development timelines, and the high failure rates. As Stephen mentioned this morning, it costs on average $2.6 billion and takes 10 to 15 years just to bring one drug to market. And as the CBO report in April 2021 mentioned, there is an 88% failure rate of clinical candidates in development. The math only works if innovators can depend on a predictable period of exclusivity once that medicine makes its way to patients. The second pillar that we need is reliable and predictable entry of generics and biosimilars. You may be surprised to hear us say that, but it's critical. This expands access and reduces costs and ensures that the broadest number of patients are able to leverage these innovative new medicines. These 2 things are designed to work together. Generic utilization since the promulgation of the Hatch-Waxman Act in 1984 has grown from 19% to 90% today. Generic prices are typically 80 to 85% lower than branded prices. And this system, when functioning as designed, delivers both innovation and competition. But that first pillar, the innovation incentives, are under serious attack. And when you erode that first pillar, the second one is inevitably going to crumble with it. I want to share too that this system has brought faster access to medicine for the United States. We heard some of that this morning, but since 2012, 85% of all new medicines launched globally have been available in the US. Contrast that with Australia and Canada, where they've had 52% of those same medicines available. Bless you.
Thanks.
For cancer medicines specifically, the US leads with 81% availability, compared, unfortunately, to significantly lower rates in other G20 countries. Building upon some of Kelly's comments this morning, the U.S. leads OECD countries in the speed of medicine access post-launch of new pharmaceuticals, with access being obtained within 4 months of approval, compared to 11 to 33 months in other OECD countries. And our IB system has helped enable that. But we're seeing this coordinated effort to dismantle this infrastructure under the guise of certain pressures like so-called affordability. And I want to be direct. Price controls erode this infrastructure. And when governments can dictate pricing, the patent right to exclude is undermined. And I think this is an argument we need to address head on. There's a couple of ways this is happening, but I've been speaking long enough, so I'll turn it over to Corey's like, yeah, keep going. All right. Buckle up. Here we go. I think some of the few critical threats that we're facing today with respect to price controls, first and foremost, the IRA. The IRA's impact effectively is patent shortening. It imposes price controls on small molecules 9 years after FDA approval, 4 years earlier than biologics. Again, this shortens patent term without changing patent law. That's the effect. And the consequences are already measurable. Vital Transformation estimates a 68% drop in medical investment for small molecules, with a projection of 79 fewer new medicines over the upcoming 20-year period. This is a direct impact of the IRA. I think one of the second major concerns are international reference pricing, which has the impact of IP devaluation. This imports what some call foreign IP weaknesses into the U.S. system. And when we anchor U.S. prices to artificially suppressed foreign prices, we adopt their implicit devaluation of IP rights. Research shows that even a 10% revenue reduction could result in 15% fewer new drug approvals. And the third that was touched on well earlier today are other price control mechanisms like leveraging buy-dole merchant rights or similar proposals. I mean, these fundamentally erode the patent bargain, dismantle key elements of the IP innovation ecosystem, and candidly, we need all the shots on goal that we can get from academia, from startups, from large pharma investments and research in view of that 88% dropout rate in clinical trials. So what do we do about it now that we're all depressed in view of all of those things? I think there are a few things we can do, but one of those is we need rigorous scholarship to make the case for IP protection. We need to quantify the innovation link. We need to measure the effective erosion of patent term, and we need to dismantle the false affordability narrative. And we look forward to your leadership and scholarship in those spaces.
Thanks, Tonya. And you're going to hear a lot of the same themes from me, and that's kind of the point, because I think it shows that this is what is on top of mind for the pharmaceutical innovators that want to make the United States the continued hub for life sciences innovation. So when I was trying to think about where to start with this topic, basically the topic, as you can see, the future of U.S. as a life sciences innovator, that is in question, as Emily was explaining, and I kept thinking, do I start with the threats or do I start with what we actually need to succeed? So I'll start with what we need to succeed, I think, is a better place. And what I came up with is that maintaining U.S. leadership in biopharmaceutical innovation, I think, is actually not that complicated. There's just 3 main ingredients, and all of these ingredients have been features of the United States for at least the last 50 years. The first one is an integrated local ecosystem that connects universities and startups to venture capital and to established innovators like us. This is needed to convert the basic science, the basic research that comes out of the former, with those who are actually able to convert them into practical innovations like medicines, which only come from the latter, the innovators that actually know how to translate and how to develop and how to make things like drugs. So that's one thing. The second ingredient, I think, for which has worked in the past, and again for the future that we need, as Tonya and others hinted at, massive and sustained investments from the private sector. This can really only come from the private sector. And the reason why Tonya also explained, it's because that's how innovation actually happens. We are in an industry where it's incredibly complicated. The failure rate, as Tonya pointed out, the 88% figure is staggering. I like to also flip that around and put it the other way. Only 12% of all molecules that enter clinical trials. So think about that for a minute. We're not talking about the earliest stages where you're just looking at compound libraries. When you're all the way to the point where you prove the concept, you have your theory, and you start testing it in clinicals, only 12% succeed, 88% fail. That's staggering. So that's why you need so much investment. And the third thing, of course, key theme here, we need a strong IP system to make it all happen. That's how it works. It's a simple recipe. It's worked for, again, almost 50 years. I say 50, the IP system has worked longer than that. But with the ecosystem points, the Bayh-Dole Act, 1980, which maybe we'll get into a little bit more later, even though we talked about it this morning, that combination of the magic three things, I think, is really about just under 50 years old now. No magic beans or fairy dust is needed, just those three things. However, because we are in the happiest place on earth, I thought when I talk now about the threats that I would kind of adopt a bit of a Disney theme. Troy can forgive me. I don't think he's in the room actually right now anyway. But I picked a couple of Disney quotes to go along and summarize these for you and hopefully wake people up after lunch. So the first is actually from Peter Pan. This comes from the J.M. Barrie play, though. I don't know if it actually got picked up in the 1939 Disney film. I can't remember. You all probably know this quote. It's every time a child says, I don't believe in fairies, there's a fairy somewhere that falls down dead. And to me, that's an apt metaphor for the broken IP narrative in the United States today, which is perhaps the greatest threat that we face, because when the narrative is so negative on IP, all the other threats, of course, grow out of that. And the sad fact is today, I think very few Americans believe in IP anymore. I think they believe in fairies probably more than they believe in the IP system, sadly. Academia, of course, demonizes it overall, and hopefully not any of the people in this room. Thank you for not demonizing it and actually for celebrating it and following the facts. But academia is against it, the media vilifies it, and of course, as a result, the general public goes along with it and roots for the demise of the system because that's what they understand and what they've been told. Meanwhile, our policymakers in Congress, I think, not much better in terms of believing in the system. If you look at the makeup of Congress, give or take about a dozen of the 535 members of Congress actually understand and regularly care about and push issues related to IP. It's amazing when you think about that, given that the IP system, a strong IP right, or having a IP system at least, it's in the Constitution. It's a constitutional mandate, not just a power, at least the way I view it. Also, just looking at the economics, IP-dependent industries account for, I think we might have heard this statistic this morning, the Chamber's done work on this, it's over 40% of U.S. GDP and over about 90% of the value of the S&P 500. How can members of Congress not be prioritizing this, and yet they don't? And this is only getting worse with the retirement of the few champions that we have on the Hill. Senator Tillis is leaving the end of this term. Senator Blackburn is leaving. Senator Coons is still there, but he stepped down from his leadership position for other reasons, but on the IP subcommittee. So we are losing the few people who do believe in IP. And this lack of belief, I think, has really, and lack of education in a lot of ways, has led to an opening for all of the false narratives to come in. And I wanted to give, one of the most recent examples of this just from, I think, last week, because these narratives, they're just incredible to me. In the GAO, so Government Accountability Office, they did a study of the Bayh-Dole framework, Marchand framework, interagency framework that came out in the last administration. I want to put aside the substance of that. You don't need to understand that for this point here. In the middle of that report, of all the things they could have said in a relatively short report, the GAO, our own government, highlighted an absolutely laughable study that claimed, I'm quoting from this now, in the pharmaceutical industry, there is no real correlation between patenting and drug innovation. I mean, that is just a remarkable thing to be coming out of our own government when I can just tell you, not just from our own firsthand experience as an innovator in the industry, but if you look back at the history of medicine, I would challenge you to find a single medicine since the 1890s, when the first pharmaceuticals came out, aspirin being one of the first. I challenge you to find even one that doesn't have a patent somewhere behind it. It's just unbelievable that we're seeing that out of our own government. And these false narratives and junk studies, like these, they lead, of course, to policies and legislation and other proposals that ultimately kill the system. So the simple fact is, I think that until Americans, everyone from the general public to the media to academia to our members of Congress, start believing in IP again, the system's going to die kind of like poor Tinkerbell. And of course, if the system dies here, tying it back to the point of this panel, the industries that rely on it, like the life sciences, cannot survive in the United States. They'll either go elsewhere or they'll just go out of business altogether, because we just can't sustain it without the recipe, as I started at the beginning, those 3 key ingredients. So obviously, what do we do about it? I mean, high level stuff, we're not going to solve it here on this panel today, but just to kind of put them out there, getting back to the things that are missing, new champions on the Hill. We need to replace the people that are missing and grow them. Academics need to, as Tonya said, be willing to objectively study and honestly report the facts, and not just follow ideologies, as we often see. The media needs to be doing the same, and an educated public needs to better understand, I think, the benefits that IP brings them every day in the healthcare space. That's in the form of innovation happening here, which means great jobs, but of course it also means the faster launches and the broader access to medicines, as you pointed out, Tonya. I'll be quicker on these others, but so number 2 of my 5, so they'll be much shorter, but I want to talk a little bit about restrictions on patent rights and patent term, which we've seen introduced or threatened to be introduced, a lot of bills pending. For this, I wanted to turn to Pinocchio, who I think said it best when he sang the song, I've got no strings to hold me down, to make me fret or make me frown. I had strings, but now I'm free. There ain't no strings on me. We have this backwards in America, and I think it's getting worse. The historic lack of strings on the direction of innovation and science, and the lack of strings on the types and numbers of inventions that we could patent and therefore invest in developing, and the lack of strings on our ability to set prices that reflect the fair market value of the innovations that we put out, are really what made America a global life sciences leader. Also, the lack of strings, of course, in the Bayh-Dole context, on when you invest in federally funded research. Science, as I think you all know in this room, it leads where it leads. No one just determines that science is going to go in this direction or that direction. We follow science if we're really research-based institutions, which we are. And in an unrestricted innovation ecosystem, that means that we're free to be able to follow it wherever it takes us and not worry about whether that means we can't get a patent on it or whether it means we can't make a return on it. And now we are tied down by a number of strings. Tonya, you mentioned, I think, the main ones. The pricing ones are incredibly concerning under the IRA. Just to put a finer point on that, this, what we call the pill penalty, the way the IRA drug price negotiation program that is now the law works is at year 13 on the market of a drug that's based in biology, a biologic drug, you get an automatic price control or price cut. No matter whether it doesn't matter if the drug was already well priced, no one asks that question. You just take the current price and you cut it as a starting point by between 25 and 60%, which is nothing to do with the value of the innovation. That's for biologics. At year 9, if it's a small molecule-based drug, meaning a traditional chemistry-based drug, the same thing happens. If you think about that, what that means for innovation, it's arbitrarily incentivizing innovators to focus more on biologics at the expense of small molecules. I will also tell you that some of the most innovative and incredibly effective and breakthrough drugs in the last few years in our portfolio, and many others too, but I'll talk about ours, are small molecule drugs, but not the old school kind of, take a pill kind of drugs. I'm talking about things like small interfering RNA, siRNA, which is actually a biological molecule, but by definitions at the FDA, its size is small enough that it qualifies as a small molecule, so it ends up getting 9 years instead of 13 under the IRA. Another one, radioligand therapy. This is where we're taking a radioactive isotope, attaching it to an individual ligand, which specifically targets only the cancer cells in prostate cancer and pancreatic cancer and others like that. Incredible stuff. Also, radioactive isotopes are small molecules. So they are getting treated like they're inferior. And I can tell you what's happening in the boardrooms, but also in the labs. It's almost second nature now because of the IRA that if we have a promising lead in certain areas of small molecules, we look at the business case and we say, we can't follow that science anymore because we're going to lose money before we even finish developing the drug on it. So we're forced into scientific directions because of the policy environment. These are the strings I'm talking about. Of course, we have other strings that are well known, Section 101, eligibility restrictions on diagnostics, on gene-based medicines. This is really concerning. They're again tying back science, to use a string metaphor again. And then proposals, which I won't get into the details, but things like the Ethic Act and the Affordable Prescription for Patients Act, which limit the types and numbers of patents you can either secure or assert, more strings. So not good for innovation. Number 3, I'll be even faster on this. I thought of, if you're a Disney person, you've been around here, one of the most beloved treats that you can get in the parks here is Dole Whip. Which of course, that's like, a soft serve version of Dole Pineapple. But that of course also captures perfectly the whiplash that we're getting out of the Buy Dole Act these days. When I know, a bad dad joke, but no, I mean, it is kind of, it's policy whiplash because we've gone back and forth depending on who's in the White House. And even, sometimes it doesn't depend on which direction is this going to go. As you heard this morning extensively, since 1980, the Bayh-Dole Act has magically really, connected the patent system to the interests of science and the interests of innovation by saying, look, if there's federal funding at the earliest stages of research, a private sector company can come in and freely license that. But then you have the last administration introducing the concept for the first time, really, seriously at least, threatening margin rights on the basis of price of a downstream product. Even though that was a product of the last administration, that draft guidance has still not been rescinded by this administration. So that leaves us, a lot of uncertainty there. But now in this administration, there's new levels of scrutiny on compliance with the formalities of Bayh-Dole at the university level, which adds more uncertainty into investing in early federally funded research. Also, the potential for a U.S. government tax or surcharge. Secretary Lutnick has talked about this a little bit, about an extra fee, basically, if you're going to license government research. All these things are really bad for taking what is already a low level of, if you look at the overall for drugs, only about 8% of all drugs, FDA-approved drugs in history have had federal funding. This is actually making us think even further that this is not something we want to invest in, even if the science is good. And then just the last two, number 4, in terms of threats, a quote from Star Wars, as a token of my goodwill, I present to you a gift, these 2 droids. I'm talking, of course, about AI, which is a gift. I would say, though, that these days it's much more, at least in our industry, of an efficiency tool. You heard this a little bit from the Imagineer at lunch as well. We actually like to refer to it, at least today, more as augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, because we don't view it as substituting for the intelligence of our scientists and our research. It's helping. It's a tool. It's advancing it. Or as C-3PO would say, I am a protocol droid, right? It's all about protocols and things like that. It's not about substituting for human intelligence. So contrary to popular belief, these characters or things like them, R2-D2-like creatures or robots, are not in our labs creating our next generation of drugs. What it is doing is helping our scientists perform even better and being more efficient at actually, picking the winners. And that's great stuff. The problem is that our policymakers sometimes think that we're at the point where, AI is just going to substitute for the kind of scientific research and investment that we need. And that has led in the last administration to guidance on AI-assisted inventorship that has made it or called into question the ability to patent drugs that were invented with the assistance of AI. To be clear, they're not being invented by AI. And even though this administration has very helpfully, I think, rescinded that guidance, it's only a matter of time before this gets challenged in courts and opportunistic litigants start to argue that, hey, 20 years ago, it looks like you used AI in the process of developing that drug, so now I want it to try to invalidate it in court. So until we get some certainty there, I think also the U.S. is a bit of a, possibly in trouble there, because we have a unique conception law that so far kind of conceptually ties invention to the mind of the inventor. No other country has this. So it's something we need to get right if we want to be the hub for life science innovation. The very last thing, I have to mention this because it's just a perfect fit for my Disney theme. Secretary Lutnick, in his speech at last year's National Inventors Hall of Fame induction ceremony, he gave what I call his Toy Story speech, because he told inventors, and it was something very close to the Toy Story line, "You've got a friend in me." Now that, of course, is not a threat. It's the opposite. It's it's an incredible invitation to say, hey, we've got your back. We actually care about America's innovators. But I bring it up in the context of the threats because the fact that our Secretary of Commerce had to affirmatively say that to inventors points to the wild swings that we have had to approaches to IP policy over from one administration to the next. And that is incredibly damaging for industries like ours that, as Tonya pointed out, we have a 10 to 15-year timeline on average to bring a single drug to market. If we can't predict even what's going to happen 4 years from now in terms of policy, how could we possibly invest in the long term and in the future of biopharmaceutical innovation in America the way we need to? We need the long-term stability, which brings me, I'll just end on this, back to my very first point about needing to get Americans to believe again and much more in the IP system to get the formula right for us to be the hub for biopharmaceutical innovation in the future. So I'll stop there and go to you, Erika.
Okay. Just for future reference, I do not ever want to come after Corey going forward. All right. Just make a note of that. All right. I have no clever Disney references. It's okay. So I come at this question from the perspective of somebody who focuses on FDA law first and foremost, and obviously as an academic now rather than in industry, although after having spent almost 20 years working with industry, including both their companies. And I think what I'm going to focus on here is just allegations about supposed evergreening and product topping, because that has been what has consumed my interest and been the focus of my work now for this part of my work for quite a number of years. And I know most of the people in the room know what I'm talking about, but I'm just going to walk you through both what I'm hearing and what I've done, and also a little bit about what I'm working on now. So one of the things that I think we're facing is there are rhetorical claims here about what innovators are supposedly doing that land really easy with policymaking audiences and with members of the general public because of concerns about the economy and because there are concerns about the ability to afford health care. And in that kind of a broader environment, it's easy to have a kind of a nameless, faceless corporate scapegoat. And these rhetorical claims are being bolstered by problematic empirical evidence. Initially, it was a lot of sort of individual anecdotes, which for one reason or another had not been adequately researched. And then more recently, and by that I mean at this point the last half dozen years or more, data sets. And some of them purport to be sort of robust databases, and some of them are just collections of example drugs with dates and claims. But these are being used, and I'll circle back, but they're being used to support policy proposals, which you see in the academic literature, you see in the policy literature, and then you see sometimes in the form of legislative language, either proposed language that is not introduced or actually from time to time introduced language. And many of these proposals would completely eviscerate the incentive to continue working with new molecules after the initial approval. So, to give one of the examples, I've seen, I'm sure many of you have seen, the proposal that FDA approve only one clinical innovation after initial approval. Only in the way I saw it written out, only innovations in the first 3 years would benefit from 3-year exclusivity, which is a special regulatory exclusivity at FDA. And FDA, as a regulatory matter, and this is part of where I come in as well, would be actually prohibited from approving any kinds of innovations or improvements in the final 2 years before the active ingredient patent expired. I'll give you another example. proposals that would limit innovators to one patent or exclusivity in connection with a new molecular entity, the one and done proposals, for instance. Something just for the active ingredient itself, but nothing else that's embodied in that first product, no subsequent research or products that the company might develop. And from my perspective, these represent a fundamental misunderstanding of the innovation life cycle, including both the risks that are involved, but also how innovation unfolds over time. The initial identification of a potentially new, of a potentially useful active moiety, it is just the beginning, and we all know that. And turning that into one finished product that can be approved by FDA, which from an FDA perspective, that's one finished product, a particular route of administration, a particular dosage form, a particular strength, time-consuming, risky, right? 12% possibility of success after you start the clinical trials, all the while that active ingredient patent term is running. And if that patent is to mean anything, the company has to seek approval as soon as it has that first possible product ready for approval. But we all know that new molecules have all sorts of potential, right? Some have a lot of potential uses, and some of those, only some of those will have been identified at the outset. Some may become apparent during the pre-market program, but other new uses aren't apparent until much later. Some of them are in the new therapeutic class. Some of them are completely different therapeutic categories. And we also know that we have a terrible time getting anyone to study new uses after a drug is off patent, all right? So the notion that we would actually limit companies to one, for example, new indication, and we're talking about more than indications, but for now, one new indication before the active ingredient expires and permit only one of those to have exclusivity, I find that horrifying from a public health perspective. Because, I mean, that's interferon, right? You've got everyone, many people will know that example, right? Approved in the mid-1980s for hairy cell leukemia. 5 years later, hepatitis C. The company keeps working on the issue. It eventually combines it with ribavirin. It gets the cure rate up to 42%. Then it pegylates the molecule. That's the very kind of innovation that people will derisively call tweaking, all right? Pegylating the molecule in the early 2000s, all of a sudden the cure rate's up to 53% for hepatitis C, 80% for 2 of the genotypes, but it was hairy cell leukemia in the 1980s. So when someone comes in and says one new indication in the first 3 years, well, you're writing off a cure for hepatitis C when you do that, right? Another example is raloxifene, approved for osteoporosis prevention, the 1990s, breast cancer, 2007. So these are the kinds of choices that are being suggested as okay, all right? These are the losses. They're tangible losses that we'd be looking at here. And again, it's not just new uses, it's new dosage forms. It might be modifications to the active ingredient, like the pegylation of the interferon. So from my perspective, the public health implications of shutting down this kind of research, which is exactly what these proposals would do, are appalling, all right? And these proposals have their genesis in a theory that innovators are making changes to their drugs or introducing small variations to their drugs in a way that extends their patents or their exclusivities or their monopolies in the market. And I've written a lot on this. I've written quite a few things explaining why the theory can't be reconciled with the framework that governs generic drug approval and the way patents and exclusivities actually work and intersect with that framework. And I can talk more about that if people have questions. I've also written things explaining why the data that they have been trotting out don't support the theory. First of all, the anecdotes, poorly researched, they're very problematic. But the empirical studies and the data sets, they don't prove what is being claimed. What I think they prove is that innovators are doing a lot of research, and there's a lot of intellectual property attached to that research. But from my perspective, that's a good thing to have proved. What they don't prove is that this is blocking generic drugs from approval and from market entry. In fact, if you look closely at them, what you see is they don't actually talk about when generic drugs are approved and launched. There's just a lot of hand-waving about when certain patents and exclusivities expire, and we're all supposed to assume, well, that means there were no generics then. And to that, I'll say two things. First of all, the research that has been done over and over again by many, many people has shown that generic drug approval and launch is consistently 12 to 14 years after FDA first approves a new molecular entity, and that has not changed in decades. Even while innovators continue to do all sorts of important innovation with their molecules. The other thing I will say is that Professor Christina Akri, who is not here but is also affiliated with we say IPPI or IPPI?
It depends. How much do you like Mark?
Well, I like Mark a lot, so what should I say?
IPPI.
IPPI. Okay. So also affiliated with IPPI, she and I did a couple years ago an audit of one of the databases that was being touted as proof of evergreening. And we looked at every single drug in that database for which there was a readily available generic launch date on FDA's website. And what we found was that a generic drug was commercially available on average 7 years before the date that they were holding out as the point to which those companies were extending their monopolies. It was just not true. I will say that, and I'll wrap up with this, and I have more things to say on other issues if people want in the next part, but we are in the middle now of a really big project. When we wrote our paper saying that database does not support the claims for which it's being held out, we concluded it with a section saying, if you really wanted to do the research here, here's what you would actually do. You would take the new molecular entities and you would look at all the innovation and you would look at exactly when the generic drugs for each of these is being approved and when they launch. And if the launch date is not when you expect, you would look to see why, because guess what? There are a lot of reasons that might have nothing to do with the innovator's patents or exclusivity, right? They may have business reasons. They may have had trouble getting raw materials, whatever. So nobody, of course, was interested in doing that research because it would undermine the rhetorical claims. I'm being a little cynical here. Anyway, that's what we're doing. So we are in the middle of a big research project that probably is going to turn into 3 or 4 articles at the end of the day, where hopefully we will put this to bed for good.
That was an excellent summary, Erika. And I just wanted to bring together points that you made and that Corey made with respect to some of those FDA proposals you highlighted and their impact on continuing innovation, and then the framework of the IRA that Corey spoke about. So if we look specifically at small molecule cancer medicines that received FDA approval between 2008 and 2018, 65% of all of those oncology drugs received approval for at least one additional indication. And of those, 61% had at least one subsequent indication for a new type of cancer. These are the choices that are being made right now. And then 22% of those received approval for 3 or more new indications. And if you look at 2010 through 2012, 44% of post-approval indications for small molecule medicines were approved 7 years after launch, with mandatory price controls coming in at 9 years. That's the reality of the interplay of these proposals, the strings, if you will, and the really tough scientific choices that are now being made by the incentives or lack thereof, frankly, of the system that we're setting up.
Just a quick comment. You said you weren't going to do a Disney theme, but you did a great job summarizing the fairy tales of the other side. So.
All right, so I wanted to take a brief pause in case there are any questions from the audience, but if not, I have a few questions for the moderators as well. Okay, so I know all three of you covered this to some extent, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity to elaborate on what factors you think most affect the U.S.'s ability to continue to dominate in the life sciences, particularly in face of China's advances in these areas.
I'll start. I mean, I kind of set them out in my 3-ingredient recipe at the beginning, but I think we really do have a unique ecosystem. The Bayh-Dole Act set up this framework really where there's nowhere else in the world where I think we have the combination of the world's best universities that are able, using IP and other factors, to get together, do all kinds of spin outs of startups, using professors and local businesses. If you take a walk through the streets of Cambridge, Mass, for example, you'll find, all the major pharmaceutical companies have a presence there, or in comparable cities where there's relationships with universities. Same for other industries. There's this kind of integration at the early stages between industry, academia, and then the policy tools, at least historically, in place that were robust and designed to connect the dots there. You add that, again, to the strong IP system historically that we've had in this country, and we're still a strong system, don't get me wrong, with some threats looming. But those combinations are really what enable the third piece, which is the investment and the successes. Nowhere else in the world has this. Bayh-Dole is unique, but to your opening points, Emily, China is quickly catching up. They've learned from the successes, and we're sitting here going the opposite direction in some ways and threatening to shoot ourselves in the feet.
If I could just expand upon that, I think Corey's right with the three magical ingredients. I would add some sprinkles on top, if you will. I think our regulatory system in the U.S. must move fast enough to keep up with the pace of innovation. Our regulators play such an important role in achieving safety goals and ensuring that the medicines are efficacious as well. What we see is that other countries are doing that more rapidly. And in particular, if you look at the elements that we've discussed so far, other countries have this whole of government coordinated strategy that has resulted in the rapid rise that Emily spoke to in setting the stage, all while we're debating ours. And I think that has some long-term implications if we don't get our act together.
So, when I think about your question, factors that most affect our ability to continue to dominate, I wasn't sure if this was factors that are good that help us continue to, or factors that are undermining. Okay. Taking us out of the IP space for a second and squarely into the regulatory space, I would say that certainty and uncertainty are really important for innovation decisions, all right? And when there is uncertainty, for instance, about the regulatory standards, or uncertainty about liability in court as well. I mean, I think those are affecting innovation decisions. And I think we're seeing that right now in the vaccine space, a little bit of uncertainty about what the standards are going to be and what the reception is going to be at the agency. And I think we're seeing stories that is having an effect on decisions here. And so, I mean, it's part of a broader point that it is very hard to make these kinds of high-risk, 10-year, 12-year innovation, pre-market program decisions in an environment where there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think we are moving in a direction of greater uncertainty, both with respect to the regulatory framework. And I think also there are things connected to, you said, for instance, you mentioned Loper-Bright, all right, and the fact that judicial review of decisions in this space, I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now. I'm gonna say one more thing about that, about Loper-Bright. I've written about the impact of Loper-Bright at FDA, And I think that it would be smart for industry to, and I'm sure everyone is thinking about these issues already, but I think it would be smart to think about the impact of potential challenges as they relate to the Hatch-Waxman scheme. I will say that I have recently seen an argument that FDA's drafting of FDA's acceptance of and use of use codes is ultra vires, and I think that somebody will take that and run with it. And in a world where the courts are doing de novo review, it might get some reception. All right. I think it'd be a good idea to think conversely. Are there some things that the agency does that are harmful to innovation that now that Loper Bright is on the books, it might be worth thinking about getting de novo review of, okay? I've got a list. I'm sure that people in companies have lists, but that's the world we live in. All right, I'll stop there.
All right, I'm going to combine my next two questions a little bit just to give the panelists fair warning. One of the things that Corey noted earlier is that if we fail to shore up intellectual property rights, the life sciences industries in the United States may dry up or they may move elsewhere. So I think that raises the question, to what extent do you think domestic laws, regulations, policies, and so on affect the biotech industry, given that most of the largest players are really multinational companies? And then combined with that also, to the extent that you think that domestic laws and regulations and policies do have an effect, what pending or proposed legislation or even enacted legislation do you think is most likely to bolster the U.S. competitiveness in biotechnology or to harm that competitiveness?
Sure. I do think domestic policy sets the global investment baseline. I mean, the reality is that the U.S. funds the majority of the next wave of innovation. And so domestic price controls don't just impact U.S. returns, they reduce the amount of capital that's available to invest in the next wave of medicines for future generations. To your question about impact for multinationals, the reality is that multinational companies will vote with their pipelines. They're going to go to those places where they can get clinical trials up and running faster, where they can get regulatory approval more quickly because of the failure rates that we've discussed earlier. There was a National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology report released in December of last year that goes through this in some great detail. I also think IP policy in the U.S. sets global norms, and the strength of our IP protection, along with, as was spoken about during the litigation panel, the willingness of the U.S. to enforce IP trade agreements and via our diplomatic tools, shapes the international IP environment. So does our lack of willingness to enforce those same trade agreements as well. And then the last point, and I'll turn it over. Our U.S. domestic policy creates a talent and capital ecosystem that multinationals live and thrive within it.
Yeah, I'd build on those same points. Starting, though, with something you said, Tonya, really resonated with me. We are going to do everything we can to do the work that we do, whether or not the United States comes along with it, because we have an ethical imperative to do so. I mean, we have the ability to treat patients and cure diseases, and that really is central. I mean, I know there's some cynicism around that. That is really what drives our companies. Yes, we're for-profit companies, and we believe we've found a way over the last 150 years to align business interests with what our mission is. But we are in the business of creating medicine. So, we really need the U.S., I think, to be a leader there. But to your point, Tonya, we are going to invest, and we do invest in clinical trials and development and research, not only in the United States, but of course, if the conditions are best here in the U.S., that's where we'd love to be. And many of the companies, it's not a coincidence that the industry and pretty much every innovative company until recently with China, has emerged in places that had the things we've been talking about: strong IP rights, strong universities, all that kind of stuff. It's Europe, it's including Switzerland, distinguishing between the EU, and the United States and Japan. So there's that. In terms of, what is the impact of the United States on the rest of it, Tonya, I think, captured a lot of it. I just add a few quick points. Maybe to put a finer point on that, there's two dimensions to that. There's the U.S. market, and then there's the U.S. as an innovation, R&D hub, and they're both equally important. The fact that, starting with the market point, yes, the U.S. still is the biggest and most important in terms of revenue generating market on the planet for every single pharmaceutical company. And that is what enables us to actually operate globally, even if we're a multinational companies. And when you start to cut into that, it makes it harder and harder for us to actually do the work globally that we do and invest as much in R&D. So having strong IP, maybe to piece it together, strong IP rights here, even just as a market, is critical, because if we don't have that, it means we can't make the returns that fund the global structure. In terms of the R&D stuff, I don't want to underestimate, or understate that either. Having the strong IP rights, having the ecosystem, with academia, with startups, with venture capitalists here is critically important, because if you think about it this way, starting with those early stage companies, unlike a multinational where we do have the luxury of being able to say, if we can't, get protection here, maybe we can still make a play to, to do our research in Europe or China. Startup companies don't have that luxury. You're here, you've got your investors here, and if you can't get the investments here because you can't get the patents here, for example, it's just not going to happen. The investors here are going to invest in pet food or something else, right? So there's a direct correlation, I think, between having the strong IP rights and the other strong components of the ecosystem and the innovation. And then that, of course, ties into some of the leads that we build upon. So, some of our most cutting edge things, the radioligand therapy, the gene therapies, the cell therapies, were, early partnerships with universities doing this kind of work that were only happening in the United States, which is why so much of our research, even though we are a Swiss company in terms of our global headquarters and our history, so much of our research and our footprint and our global R&D headquarters is actually located here in the United States. And there's a reason for that. Real quick on the second question, what are the legislation or the concepts, at least, that are good and bad? I think what we really need to do, certainly fixing things like patent eligibility. I know we talk about this at every conference and all that stuff, but it's just real stuff, right? The diagnostics industry, in terms of the at-home test kit, at least industry, is gone from the United States. We know this, during COVID, we all got our tests from overseas. We need to fix that. Gene-based medicine, I'm very, very happy to see the Federal Circuit decision last week that upheld the patent eligibility of genetically engineered host cells used to create the vectors for gene therapy. But the district court, because of patent eligibility law, thought that those were ineligible, and it's only a matter of time before we could end up with cases that go the other way. Really damaging. We need to fix that. I mentioned, AI stuff. We need to fix that. I would love to see a bill amending Section 282 of the Patent Act, which is what allows one of the defenses there to infringement is improper inventorship. I think that's fine in a vacuum, but when people are going to use that to try to invalidate patents because you used AI, I don't think that should be a defense to patent infringement. I think if you take that off the table, it will give innovators a lot more confidence there. And then last thing, really quick, we'll get into the details, but some of the actual pending legislation that could pass is really, really scary and needs to not pass. Things like the Ethic Act, which would limit you to assert one patent per group tied together through terminal disclaimers, would be very damaging. The skinny label stuff is really scary because it links back to Erika, to your work. Skinny label, there's a case, as you probably all know, pending at the Supreme Court, Hickman versus Ameren, that's looking at the very similar issue, but there's also a piece of legislation called the Skinny Label Big Savings Act. And what it effectively would do is insulate generics from infringement liability as long as they have a skinny label, meaning that they've said they're only approved for the off-patent indication, but they're trying to argue that they should therefore then get to go out and basically do anything they want to promote their generic product for the on-patent indications. If you do that, it is effectively the same, in my mind, as these one-and-done proposals. Because even if you get these patents granted on the front end, if basically you can't enforce them as long as a generic gets a skinny label, they're useless. So you're back to the point where you have no incentive to actually invest in those later indications and the research to get those later indications if they're not going to be enforceable against generics. So I'll stop there on that. And a few thoughts?
Yeah, I have a few things. Some are similar. I think one of the things that I worry about a fair amount is just attacks generally on the Hatch-Waxman framework and misunderstandings about how it works. One of the things that I think recently I have been concerned about also is suggestions about PTO and FDA working together in ways that don't really reflect their respective areas of expertise and authority, suggesting that FDA, materials that are submitted to FDA, which has a particular expertise and statutory authority, would be relevant and understandable to PTO examiners. There's a lot in that space that I think, first of all, is attempting to fix problems that haven't been, in fact, empirically shown in the first instance, and that have the potential to create a fair amount of mischief. In terms of the global issue, and I'm kind of bouncing around a little bit, in terms of the sort of underlying global issue in the two questions, I think one of the things that still needs to be done is education of people about why the prices are different in other countries, and the prevalence of price controls and other mechanisms that are meaning that if the United States adopts some of these kinds of tactics that lower the price, like the IR, in addition to basically effectively truncating the patent life, we're getting rid of the revenue that is actually paying for the R&D that we want to see. This is domestic laws and regulations that affect, on this last bit, domestic laws and regulations that affect the biotech industry. I don't want to say, and can't really say very much on the skinny labeling issue, but what I can say and will say is that there's a whole ecosystem around how generic drugs are dispensed that effectively means they are inherently going to be dispensed for infringing uses. And it is a function of FDA's practice with respect to therapeutic equivalence ratings. It's a function of the fact that state medical practice acts don't require physicians to specify the condition of use, the patient's actual disease, that pharmacy laws don't require the pharmacist to check, and then there is automatic substitution. So even if the innovator has a patent or exclusivity for a new indication, if there is a carve-out and an A rating, substitution is going to mean that the generic product is sold and administered for the use. And our current legal system is not well designed to solve this problem. And it's really, and I've written about this, I have a piece in the George Mason Law Review from probably 10 years ago about this problem. But there's a whole lot of pieces to this working together, and it undermines, to go back to the topic of this panel, these pieces together, FDA, healthcare practices, state laws together kind of undermine the legal infrastructure that supports innovation.
I just want to add one point to that because it's really, really important point. All of what you just described in terms of the automatic substitution at the pharmacy level in the states and the regulatory system currently is the status quo for small molecules. But for biologics, there currently is no automatic substitution because interchangeability is a separate thing. And now FDA is looking to change that so that basically on day one of the launch of a biosimilar, it will be automatically prescribed for all the other uses. And that's much more, I think, damaging potentially in the biologic space.
Absolutely.
I wanted to follow up on another one of your really good points, Erika, with respect to lower prices in other countries. I alluded to it earlier, but foreign governments set prices based on local budgets, local policies, and local value judgments. And we know that many foreign countries use rigid price controls and value health improvement, some would say less than Americans. But we also know that they have less access to new innovations than we do. So importing foreign price control it's just not the answer. And then I would just add on top of that, we're saying even with a valid U.S. patent, the value of that patent would be effectively set by another country's government, which doesn't make sense either. So what about affordability? I think that's something that we, especially in innovative pharmaceutical companies, you just got to address it head on. And so let's talk about it. First, we should address the myth that drug affordability is directly linked to patents or directly linked to the number of patents or directly linked to the type of patents. It just isn't. Lower prices for U.S. consumers and for U.S. patients can only happen if people in the middle of this very complicated, depressingly, bureaucratic system take less for themselves. So just a few stats. Manufacturers typically retain half of the spending on new medicines, and that share has fallen by 16% in the time period of 2013 to 2023. If you look at 2022 to 2023 alone, the middle people, PBMs, insurers, and sometimes even the government in rebates and fees accounts for 60% of new medicine spending. So if we want to lower prices, maybe we need to get after that. And I think folks in this room can help with some important research. So again, quantifying the IP innovation link with sophisticated economic analyses, looking at specific therapeutic areas, I think that would help. Measuring that effective patent term erosion due to price controls and how that undermines the value of exclusivity, that could help. Modeling long-term pipeline impact, I think that would be informative, and I have a whole host of others, but maybe we can start there.
That's excellent. And actually, Tonya, I think you addressed one of my last questions. So taking a note from Kristen Osenga, going a little bit off script some more. So Corey, you mentioned that, the U.S. public has a rather dim view of intellectual property rights, and you gave us a great summary of kind of the multi-front assault on biopharmaceutical patent protections in particular. But the recent GAO report notwithstanding, I think even the critics agree, maybe Erika, you would agree with this too, like even some of our colleagues who aren't as supportive of the biopharmaceutical innovation would agree that the biopharmaceutical space is the one area in which we think the patent system actually works somewhat the way it's supposed to, right? Nonetheless, as Erika's comments very vividly illustrate, there's a wide spread perception that the biopharmaceutical industries are somehow abusing the patent system. And I know you don't have necessarily the facts and figures on this, but what do you think is fueling this narrative and the resulting belief that biopharmaceutical patents are somehow the appropriate pressure point by which to lower drug prices, despite what Tonya just told us, as opposed to the other boogeymen, such as the insurers, the PBMs, and other influences on pricing?
I can go on all day, but I won't. There's a variety of factors. I mean, everything from true misunderstandings. I think people don't understand the difference between a product and an invention, for one thing. So the idea of one and done, meaning how could there be more than one patent on a pharmaceutical? That's crazy, right? I always like to use a smartphone example. You look at a smartphone and it's very clear to most people that there's thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of inventions. They may not know the number, but they know that like this combines software and hardware and switches and, calculators and whatever. There's all kinds of stuff in there. When you take a pill, you don't really think about the fact that there might be more than one thing that went into that. And people don't understand, of course, who aren't experts. They don't understand how patents work. Patents don't protect products. They protect inventions. So there's that level of misunderstanding. I think there's, just a lot of special interests involved here that see an easy, quick fix to drug pricing. First of all, as we've all said, I think corporations in general, putting aside our industry, aren't exactly, viewed favorably today compared to other times in, I think, in American history. There's an anti-business sentiment that's been cultivated in the United States, and I think we're a bit of a victim of that. I think also fundamentally there's, just on the drug pricing thing in general, there is a belief that people shouldn't be profiting at all from making medicines. That would be a nice fairy world to live in. But, that's not how the real world works. It might work that way if it were free to invent drugs, but it's not. So I think people don't understand that. And I think at the end of the day, I think people are very short-term focused, right? I think about it, maybe it's a bad analogy, but just the one I always think about is like climate change, right? It's easy to say, to kind of push it down the road and worry about it later, because you want what you want now. And, that's a trade-off that it's hard for all of us, right? To stop filling up with gas or whatever if you want to affect climate change. Very few people actually, do that. So same with the patent system. I think people say, well, I'm not worried about the long-term innovation. It'll somehow happen. I just want the short-term access. So there's that trade-off. I think that's appealing. There's a lot of other things I can say, but I think we've got our work to do to really educate people, I think, about the real role that patents play, both short and long-term, in making sure that medicines get to people.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I think it's not just the biopharmaceutical industry, it's not just intellectual property rights, but kind of a public distrust of institutions generally that we're seeing in this kind of populist era, of which, biopharmaceutical happens to be, I think, a particular victim. But also following along this idea that somehow the biopharmaceutical industry should not be an industry, right? That it should just somehow happen. And Indira Gandhi has I think a famous quote saying that it's completely unethical for anyone ever to make a single rupee or dollar based on pharmaceuticals, on drugs. So, other comments?
I think building upon those 2 points, I also think there's a fundamental misperception that without IP incentives, the innovation is going to happen anyway. And because of that long lead time, because of the volume of investment needed, and because of that 12% success rate, it just isn't. Society just won't benefit from the innovations, and I don't think that's something any of us want. But there's hope. I want to end on that note. There's hope. We can fix it. There's time.
All right, so just in the last couple minutes, I wanted to try to end on a more positive note. Oh, do we have a question? Oh, thank you, Erika. Yeah, Bob. Do we have a microphone for Bob? Or
Steal one. Without a tax, basket enough.
Expanding a little bit on your last commentary on, why people hate expensive drugs kinds of things. One of the things in walking the halls of Congress that I've found is that there's constantly the counteraction to the American Invents Act, which I call the Google Executive Bonus Protection Program. But you've got to get rid of patents, and they're no good, and because they cause drugs to be expensive. And that's the focus of, numerous staffers in Congress. Drugs, are expensive all because of patents. And so you got to get rid of patents. And I'd just like to hear some of your commentary on that.
Sure. Corey, but that's okay. Close enough. Look, I think there's a lot of appeal for. I sometimes try to put myself in the shoes of patients, because of course we're all patients, right? We all experience this, and I fully understand where patients are coming from on paying for medicines. When I go and I get a bill from the doctor, I don't like it either. When my air conditioner breaks in my house and I have to pay an unexpected cost to repair it and basically get it right back to where it was before. So like you're really not seeing the benefit other than, some frustrating thing that happened and trying to get back to where you were. I think there's just an emotional kind of component to that. And I think our politicians, across the aisle have kind of tapped into that. It's a very easy proposition to go to people and say, wouldn't you like to get X cheaper, right? And something as important as medicines is an easy thing to target. And then again, going back to how do you get from that to the patents, I think the patents are this mysterious, complicated thing that a lot of people view as something that's just given to you as, like the old kind of patents back, before the statute of monopolies, where it's just some kind of, award given to you so you can make a lot of money. They don't view it as the incentive tool that it actually is that enables the production of the innovation in the first place. So I think it's just an easy target because it's something that people don't understand, and then you link it up with the prospect of short-term, cheaper stuff, particularly a life-saving set of stuff, and I think that's very appealing politically. And I understand why the politicians do it. It's just that it's really damaging to innovation and to our society on the whole. Yeah, please.
Sorry. And, I would just add, I think it's a very simple tagline and boogeyman to what is actually a really complicated problem. And solving the complicated problem is harder. So I'm just going to rattle off some benchmarks for drug pricing. Wholesale, you have the wholesale acquisition cost, you have the average wholesale price, you have the average sale price, you have the average manufacturer price, you have the best price, you have the national average drug acquisition cost, all of which go into what patients may or may not pay out of pocket. And if anyone in this room can explain how all of those things relate to each other, Disney World is yours for free for the rest of the weekend. I mean, it's incredibly complicated, and saying too many patents is such a much simpler answer.
Not to mention Nobel Prize in economics, right? Okay. Well, let's end there because I think we are now at time. Thank you all so much for your attention, and special thanks to my panelists.